court manners,
sneered Nikabrik.
but in this hole we may talk plainly. You know, and he knows, that this Telmarine boy will be king of nowhere and nobody in a week unless we can help him out of this trap in which he sits.
Perhaps, said Cornelius, your new friends would like to speak for themselves? You there, who and what are you?
Worshipful Master Doctor,
came a thin, whining voice.
So please you, I'm only a poor old woman, I am. Very obliged to his worshipful dwarfship for his friendship, I'm sure. His Majesty, bless his handsome face, has no need to be afraid of an old woman that's nearly doubled up with her rheumatics and hasn't 2 sticks to put under a kettle. I have some poor little skill, not like yours, Master Doctor, of course, in small spells and cantrips that I'd be glad to use against our enemies, if it was agreeable to all concerned. No one hates better than me.
That is all most interesting and satisfactory, said Dr. Cornelius. Now I know what you are, madam. Perhaps your other friend Nikabrik would like to give us some account of himself. A dull, grey voice, at which Peter's flesh crept, replied,
I'm hunger, I'm thirst. Where I bite, I hold till I die, and even after death they must cut out my mouthful from my enemy's body and bury it with me. I can fast 100 years and not die. I can lie 100 nights on the ice and not freeze. I can drink a river of blood and not burst. Show me your enemies.
I was pointing out last time that the Christian life is simply a process of having your natural self changed into a Christ self.
Welcome to the Inklings Variety Hour, where a handful of Inklings enthusiasts read and discuss the works of C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, and others. I have 3 friends with me that I'd like to introduce to you, listeners. So we have our producer, Logan Huggins, back with us again to discuss Prince Caspian. How are you doing, Logan?
I'm doing well. I'm happy to meet you in this underground cave with a giant stone table in the corner. I'm very excited about planning our Council of War and discussing all things Prince Caspian.
It's great. It's very homey.
Super homey.
Yeah,
I love it. A lot of good acoustical sounds in here. If anyone's complaining about sound quality for this podcast, just know it's how we recorded it in this dank, dark cave. It has nothing to do with the editing process.
That's right. That's right. We got author of the Katie Watson Mysteries in Time series, as well as Churchill's S.O.C.s, of which we are proud owners and which are quite good, and you should all go and buy them. How are you doing, Mez?
I am brilliant, and we have brought the tea and custard creams to the dark underground cave meeting.
Good. We'll need it in the days ahead. Sophie Burkhardt, who is also a podcaster who does a podcast called Beneath the Willow Tree, which we will link to, where she muses on philosophy, theology, and literature. How are you doing, Sophie?
I'm quite well. I have nothing to add to set the scene. I've just been enjoying everybody else.
Well, wonderful. Prince Caspian was C.S. Lewis's second book in his Chronicles of Narnia series. He published it in 1951. It was finished before The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was published. It is, to my mind, both the most awkward Narnia book and also, increasingly, quite a good one. It's got moments of brilliant beauty and insight, perhaps in my mind, even more so than The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Let's go ahead and talk about our reading that we had at the top. Edmund and Peter, former High Kings of Narnia, have followed Trumpkin down into Aslan's How, which is now Barrow. They're listening at the door as Nikabrik, who's the not very nice dwarf, has brought 2 of his friends to help in Caspian's rebellion. Those friends have just introduced themselves, and we're not told yet that they're a hag and a werewolf, but we get some pretty good clues. The girls, Susan and Lucy, are off on a romp with Aslan. Once again, much like in The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, but this time they're joined by Maenads and Bacchantes. the Bacchus and a lot of trees. Nikabrik, as I said, has brought a couple of friends who seem pretty intent on freaking everyone out by saying very awkward things like I'm hunger and no one hates better than me, and who indeed turn out to be a hag and a werewolf. What are your thoughts on this first part of chapter 12? Why does Lewis introduce these two characters here?
I think it's so fascinating. And we spent a lot of time talking about this on our first episode on Prince Caspian, of just the structure of the story and why C.S. Lewis painted the story and structured it out the way he did. We're in chapter 12 of a 15-chapter book. And we haven't even had a fight scene yet. We've waited so long for this whole story to get going, so to speak. We've had to wander in the wilderness. The kids were stuck on an island. We've had to sit down and listen to someone telling a story. We've had to sit down and listen to Trumpkin telling their story and then Trumpkin telling the Prince Caspian story. It's been this very intentional, slow burn. We've seen the children grumbling and complaining, but still working with each other. And last chapter, Aslan's in the picture. Everything's picking up. The party's starting. The boys run off with Trumpkin to Aslan's house, and you're like, great, let's get it going. And then, of course, they stop at the door, and we have to have this long, protracted listening session of their overhearing this conversation in the room. And if I read this as a young boy, I would have been so impatient. I was like, why would you stop at the door? Just kick the door down. Come on, get the saving Prince Caspian. But obviously, C.S. Lewis was much wiser than I am. And I think this is a very interesting window into Nikabrik and window into the possibilities that Prince Caspian had to turn to un-Aslan creatures, the dark magic. It's so vital to the story and so vital to the mission of what Prince Caspian is trying to do as sort of reviving this old Narnia. But structurally, just an interesting choice, but obviously a very intentional one by Lewis.
Yeah, it's funny, both in terms of the structure of the book, which I kind of get why Lewis is doing this, right? Because he's making a point that it doesn't so much have to do with structure as it does like kind of apologetics.
And obviously the boys aren't the main hero of any Narnia book. Like the children, it's always Aslan who saves it. It's always that. And it's always in Aslan's timing and in Aslan's way, obviously. You're totally right. It's just a funny note of that this scene, that how crucial it is and how sort of a climactic moment this is. It's still a sense of waiting anticipation because they're literally sitting at the doorstep on their tiptoes, anxiously waiting to see what happens next. And as the audience, I feel like, well, we are too. We're like, yeah, we're so close to something happening.
Yeah, also kind of like, any time now, Edmund and Peter, they're about to kill Caspian because you've been too slow in getting here. So maybe you could sort of open the door and say, hey guys, I'm here. Give Nikabrik maybe a chance to take a sober look at his own ideas about things. Maybe take a sober look at like, do I actually need to employ a hag and a werewolf to win this war? But they stay behind the door and keep listening until it's kind of too late and Nikabrik dies, which is too bad for Nikabrik. He probably wouldn't have repented, but it seems to me like the point that Lewis is making is sort of, because they're talking about, well, why hasn't help showed up yet? I thought, and help is like literally at the door. It's a very like second coming kind of point, right? Oh, he's never going to come when he could be on his way right now, right? Other readings of that and why they're waiting and what the hag and the werewolf even are?
Yeah, I had a couple of thoughts when Logan was talking, just sort of comparing Caspian's advisors with Miraz's advisors later on, and the fact that Caspian goes and he follows the correct advisors instead of giving in to treacherous ones like Nikabrik with his hag and his werewolf. And then I was also thinking, so we mentioned in the past about how, according to Michael Ward, every Narnia book encapsulates a specific planet. And Prince Caspian, he argues, is Mars. So it has to do with knighthood and chivalry and honor. And I think honor is such a big thing throughout this whole book. And it really comes up at the end. I was reading the last maybe 2 chapters, and like honor is almost every other paragraph. That word is popping up. And so I think this is sort of showing Caspian's commitment to doing something the honorable way, which you kind of already mentioned, but just to pull out that notion of this being a Marsian book.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Caspian surrounds himself with people who don't just pay lip service to whatever Caspian wants to do, which is different from Miraz. And Miraz surrounds himself with people who need to be sycophants, and they end up, as we will see, stabbing him in the back. Caspian at least gets stabbed in the front. They try to stab him in the front, and then they get a bite in. There's a healthiness to this kind of council.
I think you're totally right on, and I think it ties into that theme we spoke about on the first episode of Prince Caspian, this theme of community throughout the whole book here. So many examples of good community, and we see it with the children as they're trying to figure out what to do on the island and how they're trying to figure out how to follow Aslan. There's so much counsel and so much going back and forth and giving advice and taking advice and making their own decision, but I'm sorry, let's try it again this way. There's so much of that, and we see that also with Caspian and Truffle Hunter. And even though Nikabrik is sort of a bad apple in that group, they're still counseling. They're still listening to one another. And I think you're totally right. I think it's interesting to take those examples of good community and compare them to Miraz later on with these two lords, and sort of seeing how manipulative and self-seeking and sort of self-devouring that type of community is. There is a treachery, but it's overcome by the community there. It's really cool.
Nikabrik keeps using talking plainly as an excuse to be really rude, right? Which is interesting because, like, on the one hand, like, you want to have people who have different opinions from you. That's how you win anything. But Nikabrik, kind of to Mez and Sophie's point from last episode about needing to have a view of the world that does not, I don't know, that's generous, right? And that's not stripped down to a sort of lack of belief, that seems to extend to manners here as well, right? That Nikabrik makes fun of the people who are saying, you need to be a little more respectful to your king, man. And Nikabrik says, court manners, but in this hole we may talk plainly, right? Using this idea of like, oh, we're all in this hole together, we're all in this together, we can talk to each other as equals here, as a way to kind of disenchant the world in a way, right? And that's not to say he doesn't believe in magic. He clearly does, but he believes in ends-justifies-means magic, right? In a bluntness, he kind of dresses the world in a sort of bluntness to make what he plans to do more palatable, right? At the end of the day, this is just about either our side wins or their side wins. I want our side to win. Therefore, let's call up the White Witch, right? I'm sure Lewis saw it in his day happen where people, they didn't want to stand on ceremony. They wanted to be frank with you. They wanted to, talk to you in a sort of unadorned way, but smuggled in that was a particular view of the world that was disenchanting. Ends justifies means arguments to sort of seem more obviously the right thing to do. So they get in a big fight. At the end, Caspian is hurt. The werewolf is killed while turning into a werewolf. The hag's head is lopped off. Nikabrik is stabbed. And Caspian has been hurt, which means he can't fight in any battles in upcoming chapters. Apparently the way that he got hurt was because he was bitten by a werewolf. So I want to know, like, why didn't Lewis pursue this further? There's just so much potential here for Caspian as a werewolf king. Lewis just drops it. Even like all the stuff with the moon in the previous chapters, I mean, it's just laid out there for him. He does not take the bait. Caspian does not end up being a werewolf king that we know of. Our very first episode of Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, we noticed that there is apparently a talking kangaroo who is restored to life, and we called for a fan fiction piece about the last talking kangaroo in Narnia, but I'd like to call for another fan fiction piece about Caspian the Werewolf King, and if he could cross over with the talking kangaroo, so much the better.
Sophie's made a great point that in the filmic version of Caspian the Werewolf King, Robert Pattinson could probably step in. Pattinson could step in and play that role. I'm feeling a real sort of Twilight vibe, which I'm sure Lewis would totally approve of. Not.
Yeah, Lewis would have been just the biggest fan of Twilight, I think.
I think one possibility is maybe Lewis knew what he wanted to do with Caspian in The Dawn Treader. So maybe the idea of having like a werewolf sea captain was just too much, and he knew like the smell of wet dog on a ship somewhere would just be too much for all the characters. So maybe he just was like, I'll just scrap this whole idea.
But there's wet mouse, right? I mean, wet mouse probably smells as bad as wet dog, right?
That's probably true. I can't imagine Reapy Cheap allows himself to smell bad whatsoever, but you may be right.
Yeah. So probably the greatest weakness of this book is not not following that thread to give us Caspian the Werewolf King.
Well, that's classic C.S. Lewis, right?
Yeah.
Pricking your imagination and letting it spin off into any world of ways. So
Yeah. In seriousness, the thing where if you get bitten by a werewolf, you turn into a werewolf, I think is pretty late in werewolf lore. I think we don't really get that until like the Victorians, and medieval werewolves, just like somehow were werewolves, often were quite sympathetic, actually, which would have been a great story if Caspian was one of them. But
internet and listeners out there, this is your call to action. Please submit your fan fiction, The Talking Kangaroo and Werewolf King Caspian.
anything else we want to say about Chapter 12, Sorcery and Sudden Vengeance? I feel like there's so much here.
Well, I don't know if this is anything novel to what has already been said, but maybe just put a slightly different way. I feel like you mentioned, it's a shame for Nikabrik that he didn't sort of repent before it was too late. But I feel like he really does represent kind of going back to an Eden moment where he, like you said, he's not ignorant of the magic. He knows good and well. He knows his history, actually, of Narnia, but he's chosen to abandon Aslan because he believes Aslan is not good, that Aslan has abandoned him. And so he chooses to define good on his own terms, as you said, to justify an end through those means. And so, yeah, I think he had to die because it basically shows good is objectively defined here in the death of Nikabrik.
Nikabrik seems to be kind of an ancestor of the whole dwarves for the dwarves thing that we get in the last battle later on. This idea of like we define good based on who's going to help our people out and kind of defining our people as the people that are like me in this particular way. If Aslan is good, he will prefer the dwarves like the White Witch seemed to do. And if he doesn't prefer the dwarves, he probably is not good. One question I wanted to ask. Truffle Hunter keeps talking about how beasts are more patient than dwarves. Where's Lewis getting the idea? Like, if you've ever, fixed food for a dog, you will know that beasts are not always particularly patient. And we keep hearing from Truffle Hunter, beasts remember, right? Beasts know that things have never been right until a son of Adam or daughter of Eve has been on the throne. Beasts are patient. We wait for Aslan, Truffle Hunter is like the true believer. I mean, it feels true. I don't know why it does. And I don't know why badgers in particular would be seen as being patient. So yeah, I want to hear your thoughts on this question.
Well, I have some thoughts because I'm a big fan of badgers. And actually, it's worth sharing a little anecdote that when my husband Gordon and I and Sophie were in the UK recently, we sat outside of a badger feeding area and waited a very long time for the English badgers to come along and munch the scraps that were left for them. So maybe there's something to the patience thing. We certainly learned patience waiting for them. But yeah, I don't see the American badger as a little feistier, but the British badger is kind of a lumbering, wind in the willows kind of character. Constance from Redwall. In fact, maybe there's something to the fact that her name is Constance in Redwall.
Yeah.
But we talked in the last episode about nature kind of holding on to the old stories and the truth, even when people had forgotten it. And I feel like to a lesser extent, although the beasts are mortal beings, that they sort of are rooted to that earth story, that truth that the men and the dwarves have forgotten, perhaps.
When I was thinking too, in Harry Potter, Hufflepuff, the house of perseverance and determination, is Badger. And so I think that at least for badgers, there's some kind of symbolism throughout history of badgers representing this patience and perseverance. I have no idea why it is that way. And I'm assuming Rowling had that from more than just Lewis. I doubt she was just pulling from him to have that imagery, but
something to go and look up because badgers are well worth the research.
Yeah. I wonder if Badger from Wind in the Willows and Truffle Hunter are enough, or if there is some, like you're saying, Sophie, just older lore about badgers being really patient. The interesting thing, though, is that, unlike Nikabrik, Truffle Hunter is not speciesist. Truffle Hunter doesn't say, we badgers, are patient. We badgers are, we know that Aslan is real and we believe in him and things like that. Beasts in general. And there's something to, when you see animals suffer, there's a way in which their patience seems more beautiful even in some ways than human patience, because they have no means of understanding their suffering. They're not necessarily able to look forward to a time when their suffering will get better, but they're patient in the moment, right, of suffering. And you have Paul's whole, creation groans as in the pains of childbirth, right, for the sons of God to be revealed. I wonder if that's not in there as well. Credit for long suffering that we tend to attribute to animals. But yeah, I mean, it does seem specifically to be brought out in the case of the badger in this book. So.
Yeah, I think it plays into that whole idea we were speaking about last time of how Lewis is uplifting this idea of nature. Not only are the trees in Narnia and the rocks and the beauty of the land so heightened, and Lewis is definitely like elevating that, but he's even elevating the role of animals by giving them speech, by giving them not just personality, but oftentimes really noble personalities. He gives Trufflehunter this constant, long-suffering, I remember the old story. He's sort of perseverance and personified. He gives Reepicheep this noble, eloquent, almost too eloquent, knightly personality. To me, it plays into this whole idea of Lewis elevating nature and animals, and part of that. He not only oversaturates the trees and the spirits and the river gods, but he does the same thing with the animals that he brings into the stories. They're all serving their purpose. They're all fulfilling their purpose within nature in sort of exceedingly noble and relatable and personable ways, which I think is just sort of a classic Lewis.
Yeah, that's a great point, Logan. And that's absolutely Lewis in his idea of how the animal world can be redeemed, right? And the problem of pain, he talks about how animals seem to become more themselves and also almost like acquire personalities, right, in the presence of humans who have a kind of identity conferring sub-creative role. It's this odd, like, animal fable, Wind in the Willows-ish, like, kind of caricature meets, like, the redemption of creation. In some ways, in Lewis's mind, they seem to be very similar, if not the same phenomenon. So it's super interesting.
Something that I think is super key to when Caspian and Peter and Edmund first meet, that I think ties into a lot of the things we've already talked about, is how, well, let's use the bad example of the movie. In the movie version, when Peter and Caspian meet, there's this classic Hollywood rivalry between Caspian and Peter, and they're like, oh, who's going to be the real High King? And that's just not here at all, because, as we've mentioned before, this book is so much to do about honor and the knightly sort of way of being medieval knight. And I love when Peter meets Caspian and Caspian meets Peter, they come to each other and they say, oh, your highness is welcome here. And Peter's like, no, your highness is welcome here. And it's a little on the nose, but I love it. He's like, I'm not here to be the king. I'm here to make sure you're the king. And it's such a great picture of that Christian idea of we're all kings and queens and we're all heirs to the throne, but we are serving one another and we're giving honor to one another, sort of lifting up one another, not trying to vie for who's in charge, who's the lead here and there. It's, no, I'm here to serve you. Well, I'm here to serve you. And the way Lewis intentionally made that, the first lines they say to each other totally connects with the whole idea of knightly honor giving and honor receiving that we see throughout the book.
Yeah, Hollywood has a really hard time refusing opportunities for conflict because they know that the audience is more likely to be interested if they see some kind of conflict.
We finally have the two main characters, quote unquote, meet, and the first words out of their mouths are, well, I'm here to serve you. Well, I'm here to serve you. I'm here to put you on your rightful place. I think that's so beautiful. Between two male characters, too, I think is such a graceful picture, too, of brotherly honor. I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. This is just kind of an extension of the graceful way that they've already been interacting, that Peter, of course, is the one to challenge Miraz and insists on doing it because Caspian is hurt. He dictates to Cornelius. He's like, I think I remember how to do this. Peter, by the gift of Aslan, by election, by prescription, and by conquest, High King over all kings in Narnia, Emperor of the Lone Islands, and Lord of Cair Paravel, Knight of the most noble Order of the Lion, to Miraz, son of Caspian the Eighth, sometime Lord Protector of Narnia, and now styling himself King of Narnia, greeting. Have you got that? Narnia, greeting, muttered the doctor. Yes, sire. Then begin a new paragraph, said Peter. For to prevent the effusion of blood and for the avoiding of all other inconveniences likely to grow from the wars now levied in our realm of Narnia, it is our pleasure to adventure our royal person on behalf of our trusty and well-beloved Caspian in clean wager of battle, to prove upon your lordship's body that the said Caspian is lawful king under us in Narnia, both by our gift and by the laws of the Telmarines, and your lordship twice guilty of treachery, both in withholding the dominion of Narnia from the said Caspian, and in the most abominable, don't forget to spell it with an H, Doctor, bloody and unnatural murder of your kindly lord and brother King Caspian, ninth of that name. Wherefore, we most heartily provoke, challenge, and defy your lordship to the said combat in Monomachi, and have sent these letters by the hand of our well-beloved and royal brother Edmund, sometime king under us in Narnia, Duke of Lantern Waste, and Count of the Western March, Knight of the Noble Order of the Table, to whom we have given full power of determining with your lordship all the conditions of said battle, given at our lodging in Aslan's Howe this 12th day of the month Greenroof, in the first year of Caspian, 10th of Narnia. That ought to do, said Peter, drawing a deep breath.
I think to me, the biggest part of this is just it speaking to the overall Mars feel of the book and the chivalry and the honor. Like, even though it's something so small, it just shows again and again that Aslan's side is going to go about this the right way, where we see Miraz and his men consistently going about it the most wrong way possible.
Yeah, and they really do. So you have these two advisors who I never remember until I read the book again. Glozell and Caspian. You know, the Spian ending of a name seems to be a Telmarine thing, but they are conspiring together and decide, well, you know, it would be great if the king, if we didn't have to fight, and if the king, you know, took this kid on in single combat, and if the king lost, we could still take them on. But if the king won, then all the better. We wouldn't have to fight, and it's time that the king gave us something for all our effort. Might as well talk him into something that could get him killed. So they kind of use this reverse psychology on Miraz, because Miraz is in a situation where he's like, well, we're winning the war. I don't need to do single combat. And they're like, oh, absolutely right. You wouldn't want to hazard your royal person. Miraz is like, well, what are you talking about? Of course I'll win. This guy's a kid.
Yeah, you shouldn't hazard it as someone your age. And he's like, wait, what? Oh, all right, fine, I'll do it. Yeah.
So I'm to be a dotard as well as a dastard? It's great.
It's that classic Lewis, the antagonists eating themselves. They are destroyed by themselves, even more so than Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe, where Aslan comes and essentially defeats the White Witch. Here, Peter has the fight Miraz, but Miraz literally gets stabbed in the back by his own evil supporters, his own evil community behind him. And you see that again and again in so much of C.S. Lewis's work. All good people have to do is sort of stand up against evil, but evil itself will end up consuming itself, because that's what it is.
Yeah, it's super fun to watch. I can't imagine, you know, a real king being played quite this easily, but maybe some have been with very short reigns. I don't know. They're basically kind of like, oh, of course you're not a coward, but I must plainly say that to meet that young man in battle is more than my heart would serve me for. In the end, of course, he says, I'll tell you what it is, my lords, with your womanish counsels ever shying from the true point, which is one of policy, you have done the very opposite of your intent. I had meant to refuse it, but I'll accept it. Do you hear? Accept it! I'll not be shamed because some witchcraft or treason has frozen both your bloods. Then they pretend to beg him, no, please don't accept this duel, and then it's on. I can't help but remember an episode of Arrested Development where Lucille Bluth doesn't want Buster to go to army, and Buster comes home and she's like, so you're back. Oh, I'm so glad. There's no shame in being a coward. It's just a great line. And Buster has all these stuffed animals and he's like, would a coward have these, mother? So we've got this ending with Reepicheep where the different animals are sort of volunteering to be in the lists or be marshals, and asserting kind of the bears are asserting their ancient right to be marshals in duels, which apparently I guess happen happened all the time. Like, this is maybe how you settle things in ancient Narnia, just a duel, and Aslan lets the person who's in the right win. Lots of honors being bestowed on different animals, whether it's the bears, and on condition they don't suck their paws, or
even after they suck their paws, even despite the fact that they're still sucking their paws, King Peter's like, well, you're still going to be my marshal. I love that.
Yeah. Don't let him, whispered Trumpkin to Peter. He's a good creature, but he'll shame us all. He'll go to sleep and he will suck his paws in front of the enemy too. So it's just a great comedic moment, as is the thing with Reepicheep, where they're like, I don't really want Reepicheep up there because he's really small. Peter's
quick on his feet, and he gracefully turns Reepicheep down, but a very honorable turning down. He denies him the role, but it's because of my honor for the enemy, because some people are afraid of mice, and that would be an unfair advantage, Reepicheep, and you're too valuable, so maybe not this time. And so Reepicheep just is like,
you're the mirror of honor.
Yes.
It's such a wonderful picture too, and a laughable one, of the weak shaming the strong. We're talking about bears and mice, but of course remember that it's for children and it's a child who's taking on Miraz in a duel. So at every level it's the weak shaming the strong.
Yeah, I love the it is your right, said Peter, and you shall be, when he's talking to the bear, and you shall be one of the marshals, but you must remember not to suck your paws. Of course not, said the bear in a very shocked voice. Why are you doing it this minute? Bellowed Trumpkin. The bear whipped his paw out of his mouth and pretended he hadn't heard. But yeah, absolutely. The sort of ragtag character of Caspian's army, that it's not only a boy leading an army, but it's a boy with strange people, right, that hadn't been really even allowed to exist up until 5 minutes ago for a very long time.
I think you're totally right. I think that's such a great thing to remember about Caspian's army versus Miraz's army, and that idea of like having a diverse community versus a community of just, we assume, just all grown up men of Telmarine. And it goes back to that theory we were talked about a couple episodes ago about how this is such a neat picture. And if you stretch it in the right way, you can almost say this is like the Book of Acts version of the Narnia story, where this is a story of a ragtag group of very desperate and different patchwork of people and communities all coming together. The only thing they have in common is Aslan. And the only thing they have in common that they're fighting for, putting their hopes in, is Aslan and their leader, Prince Caspian, essentially. And they really have nothing else in common. And so I love that. That's such a clever and fun picture of the church. And we see throughout the New Testament and still today.
Yeah. And it lines up with, what Lewis kind of says about the church in the Screwtape Letters. You've got the grocer with a rather oily expression on his face, and, someone whose shoes squeak, and all of these other, things. But in, like you were saying, the weakness is part of the point. We have that strength and weakness on display in chapter 14, How All Were Very Busy, where you have this sort of duel between Peter and Miraz. When you have duels in literature, so often they just blow up in everybody's face, and this seems to be, not an exception to that. And you get this kind of like blow-by-blow account from the audience. You don't really get to be inside Peter's head as he's dueling Miraz. This is all sort of secondhand, and Edmund and Trumpkin and Caspian kind of all talking to each other, describing what's going on. Just about the time Peter gets the best of Miraz, the Telmarines are surrounded by a tree army, and we see what's kind of been happening all day throughout the former Telmarine occupied land of Narnia. But soon neither their cries, the cries of the Telmarines, nor the sound of weapons could be heard any more, for both were drowned in the ocean-like roar of the awakened trees as they plunged through the ranks of Peter's army and then on in pursuit of the Telmarines. Have you ever stood at the edge of a great wood on a high ridge when a wild southwester broke over it in full fury on an autumn evening? Imagine that sound. And then imagine that the wood, instead of being fixed to one place, was rushing at you, and was no longer trees, but huge people, yet still like trees, because their long arms waved like branches and their heads tossed and leaves fell round them in showers. It was like that for the Telmarines. It was a little alarming, even for the Narnians. So you have this odd culmination of all the wildness that we've seen so far, right? And it's kind of like a battle, sort of, but it's more like a romp. And Aslan is going around with Bacchus and sort of setting the Telmarine country to rights. The Telmarines, the way it gets brought up is they try to cross the bridge into Baruna, but the bridge is gone. And why is the bridge gone? The bridge is gone because earlier that morning, the god of the river asked Aslan to loose my chains. Who on earth is that? Whispered Susan. I think it's the river god, but hush, said Lucy. Bacchus, said Aslan, deliver him from his chains. Bacchus causes vines to grow around the bridge and get rid of the bridge. What do y'all make of that? What's wrong with bridges? Why is Aslan interested in destroying a country's infrastructure, whether it be bridges or schools?
I think it just depends on the infrastructure. In this case, the bridge was clearly posing a hindrance to the romp. So, yeah, and with the schools, we talked about how schools in Lewis's day were often trying to disenchant children and de-educate them, suck the wonder right out of them. So I think he's very selective about which infrastructure he's down on, because of course Aslan's the one who's set them out to sort of increase, multiply, and civilize the land as well. So there's a kind of good civility in that, which is maybe just utilitarian. Why this bridge particularly, I don't know, but obviously it had to go.
Clearly.
Whenever I read this part of the book, I kept thinking, like, what would hold back a river god? Like, I guess your first thought is, well, a dam would make the most sense, like a dam stopping the river, sort of. But then I kept thinking, well, that's straight out of the Two Towers. Like, that's literally Isengard, the Ents. That's how the Ents sort of save the day, is that they release the river and saves the day at the end. So I thought, well, maybe despite all of Lewis sort of sticking his nose up at Tolkien throughout this book and sort of teasing him a lot about his mythology, maybe he just didn't want to go that far to actually steal a scene from Two Towers.
It also does make me think of the flooding of the River Anduin in Fellowship, when the Black Riders are taken out by the horse-like waves of the river.
Yeah. I mean, there's this odd dance that's done in this book, right, between nature being subject to humans, and like in this chapter, that's sort of not quite happening in exactly the way we're used to seeing in a lot of Narnia. As far as river gods and bridges go, I can't help but think of Lewis's sort of frenemy, T.S. Eliot's The Dry Salvages and the Four Quartets. I do not know much about gods, but I think that the river is a strong brown god, sullen, untamed, and intractable, patient to some degree, at first recognized as a frontier, useful, untrustworthy as a conveyor of commerce, then only a problem confronting the builder of bridges. The problem once solved, the brown god is almost forgotten by the dwellers in cities. Ever, however, implacable, keeping his seasons and rages, destroyer, reminder of what men choose to forget, unhonored, unpropitiated by worshippers of the machine, but waiting, watching and waiting. His rhythm was present in the nursery bedroom, in the rank ailanthus of the April dooryard, in the smell of grapes on the autumn table, and the evening circle in the winter gaslight. Yeah, this idea of finding a way to forget about nature, right, and finding a way to forget about the river, and the inconvenience of nature being a reminder that the world is not simply centered around us.
Have any of y'all ever heard of the LA River? I don't know if this is like historical fact, but this is the way it was told to me. If you're ever in Los Angeles, in sort of the main through of LA, which as we all know, it doesn't rain much in LA, but apparently back in like the 20s and 30s, there was a river, like the Los Angeles River, very natural, flowing through downtown LA area. And apparently one very particularly rainy season, it flooded. And so everyone's sort of like, oh my gosh, we can't have this ever happen again. And so what they did was they created what is now the LA River. It's this enormous concrete trench down the center of LA, and it's all very man-made. It's just got rain pipes coming here and there, but it's literally just a big, giant, pitiful trickle of water. It's such an embarrassment because they overreacted that one time, and now for the last 70 years, they replaced this natural body of water throughout a city that really desperately needs water into this sort of man-made concrete rain wash. They try to like make it like a walking track, or they try to put like, oh, it's a great place to ride your bicycle. It's like, it's a great place for homeless people to live now. That's what that is. But anyway, that classic sort of man trying to put nature in its place, whether responding to it or overreacting to it and messing up nature by our own short-sighted ways.
This is a brilliant example. It's
Yeah.
so sad. What would Lewis say?
If Aslan came to LA and tried to reawaken the god of the LA River, there would be many bridges, many things to tear down. Let's just say that. Yeah.
There's a fan fiction for you.
Or maybe Caspian the werewolf could come to LA.
Like Werewolf in
And,
London is now Werewolf in LA. Yeah, exactly.
And
Oh, man.
he and the kangaroo could help tear down the fake river. Yeah, this is really C.S. Lewis's most romantic, and romantic in like the uppercase R sense of the word. Like he's a lot like a Wordsworth or Coleridge. Here he has even or perhaps especially schools being disrupted by Aslan and the various weird scenes of schoolroom dysfunction, right? Aslan makes right by essentially destroying the educational project that these people were engaging in. So we've got Miss Prizzle, right, which is great, kind of the anti magic school bus, Miss Prizzle. But please, Miss Prizzle, began Gwendolen. Did you hear what I said, Gwendolen? Asked Miss Prizzle. But please, Miss Prizzle, said Gwendolen, there's a lion. Take 2 order marks for talking nonsense, said Miss Prizzle. And now, a roar interrupted her. Ivy came curling in at the windows of the classroom. The walls became a mass of shimmering green, and leafy branches arched overhead where the ceiling had been. Miss Prizzle found she was standing on grass in a forest glade. She clutched at her desk to steady herself and found that the desk was a rose bush. Wild people such as she had never imagined were crowding round her. Then she saw the lion, screamed and fled, and with her fled her class, who were mostly dumpy, prim little girls with fat legs. Gwendolen hesitated. You'll stay with us, sweetheart, said Aslan. Oh, may I? Oh, thank you, said Gwendolen. Instantly she joined hands with 2 of the Maenads, who whirled her round in a merry dance and helped her take off some of the unnecessary and uncomfortable clothes she was wearing. So really weird. This is Lewis at his most romantic and also Lewis at his weirdest, I think. What do you all make of this, as well as like the accompanying thing where it's a teacher being hassled by pig-like little boys who get turned into pigs?
I was also just thinking of the Trunchbull. It's kind of rolled
Oh,
up.
yeah.
Yes.
I think C.S. Lewis is obviously writing this for children, and all children sort of universally have this great antagonist of school or teacher, like sort of naturally we sort of revolt against teachers. And so I almost, what would kids enjoy in this book? Oh, how about a story about a schoolhouse that gets destroyed? Like, yeah, go students. But I think also what's interesting is there's 2 schools here. There's the first school where the antagonist is the teacher, and Aslan liberates the student from classroom setting. The first thing I thought of was Pink Floyd, Brick in the Wall. We don't need no education, all this fun stuff. But then, of course, C.S. Lewis is not trying to make that point. He's making the point of revival. And I love that he gives a second example of the teacher being liberated from bratty students. So it's not like your classic sort of kids literature. The teachers are Miss Trunchbull. The teacher is the bad guy. Aslan's liberating everyone out of this terrible system, I guess, for lack of a better word. So I don't know. I love that he has 2 different examples. One's very Pink Floyd and one's very Miss Honey from Matilda.
Yeah, I can definitely see both of these scenarios in a Roald Dahl book, for sure. Yeah, it's really it's got that kind of
fantastic sort of children's fantasy,
Yeah. I don't know. Cruelty is probably the wrong word, but just edginess.
It's that classic sort of medieval myths and legends, like, well, you get what you deserve, bratty children, and now you're a herd of pigs, and whatever. It's definitely that old school bad people get punished, and bratty kids get their comeuppance, and awful teachers run away screaming. So I think it's very old school in that sense.
Yeah,
I wonder too, once again, how much of this is harkening back to Lewis's own childhood experience, because in his biography, he doesn't speak too fondly of his school day experiences. Definitely some teachers that he would probably have fantasized this happening to.
Yeah.
And peers as well. So maybe this is his sort of writing out his childhood fantasies.
I could definitely see that. And certainly, like, it's not unbiblical for little boys who are teasing a prophet for being bald to have bears sicked on them. It's in there. One other thing I wanted to bring up. Everything's so modern. For a moment, it's as though we leave Narnia and we're in this sort of like Roald Dahlian universe, right? Like it's
What do you mean by modern?
well, you've got school mistresses. They're having a history lesson, right? Narnian girls with their hair done very tight and ugly tight collars around their necks and thick, tickly stockings on their legs. We're having a history lesson. The sort of history that was taught in Narnia under Miraz's rule was duller than the truest history you ever read and less true than the most exciting adventure story. So it's just like this very modernist kind of aesthetic, very particular to 20th century England. It's so odd, and it takes me out of the novel itself. Like the illusion kind of is broken by these sorts of little satirical moments, right?
I wonder if that's what he's aiming at, that you almost feel this yucky sort of, oh, I'm in this horrible modern world that sounds just like my world. I want the bacchanale. I want the gods. I want the romp. And that's what Aslan is giving us. He's kind of washing the slate clean and bringing back all of these glorious things that to children are just so delicious and desirable. He's bringing joy back where everything's been sort of muted and monochrome. So I almost feel like he did that very intentionally, because he's sort of picturing a world that he dreamed of, that he longs for, and then picturing this quote unquote real world. And he's bringing the three-dimensional multicolor technicolor world in full force. And so you really feel that wave crashing in.
It is of a piece of the other sort of tones that he experiments with at the beginning, where it feels like a modern adventure story at the beginning where they're just not like on an island and they're just kind of wandering around and exploring and trying to figure out how to eat and stuff like that. Like it does not seem like the fantasy genre, other than they got there somehow, right?
One more note while we're talking about the education element of this. It just came to me of one of my favorite takeaways from Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe is what the professor says when at the very end of the book, and then before they get into Narnia for real, they sort of come and ask them, like, Professor, is this possible? Like, is Lucy lying? And he sort of hits them with like, what are they teaching in these schools now? Like, don't they teach logic in these modern schools? And I love that, because it's sort of that classic C.S. Lewis. If you're not studying the old stories, if you're not studying the mythology and the everything sort of under the lens of Aslan and under the lens of Christ, see the same thing happen again in the space trilogy of like Weston at the end of Out of the Silent Planet. He's trying to be so sophisticated and he's going on and on about the progress of humanity does not stop for species and then Ransom has to turn around and try to explain it in like very concrete terms, and essentially he's just like, this guy's crazy, I don't know what he's going on about. Like, it's just you see again and again, Mez mentioned earlier, the weak critiquing the strong and the weak overcoming the strong, because the strong are so self-absorbed or so overly educated. And yeah, it's great. Classic Lewis.
Yeah, that's so good. And there's such an assumption, still. And a lot of times, like now, it's just based on the fact that we have more efficient ways of like wasting our own time than people used to. But yeah, this assumption I encounter like in a lot of my students as well, of just like, oh well, we've progressed more than they have. We're a little bit better than the people were back then, without really like questioning it or thinking, well, why? What makes us better? What makes us more advanced? Like, what are the things? Can you give me a philosophical argument that supports the thing that you're just kind of assuming is true? And Lewis definitely supplies philosophical arguments on the other side. All right, chapter 15, last chapter. Aslan makes a door in the air, and I want to hear how many of you, while walking through the forest as a child, ever saw a door-like thing in the air and tried to go through it to get to another world. Yeah,
that's a classic move.
Here you have the door actually is a door out of this enchanted world, right? But again, just like in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, our world is fairy to Narnians. A little bit like the wardrobe. It's interesting the way that this is done, right? And that the reason that the kids have to go back is because they're trying to prove to the Telmarines that this is not a trick. Because the Telmarines, as it turns out, came originally from Earth and settled in Telmar for a while, back in the days when there were more doors between Narnia and our world. If Narnia was created during Victorian times, how do we get, I'm assuming, 16th, 17th century pirates finding a door into Telmar, wherever that is? Anyone want to tackle that here at the end of the episode?
Only thing I can say is that the chronology doesn't match up. So maybe it wasn't Victorian times when Diggory was there. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, as we know, time works differently in Narnia as it does in our world. So maybe they stumbled into that cave and got time warped forward for them in a way that worked different than the children.
Yeah, I could buy that.
Yeah, it's the magic. Yeah.
So they settle in Telmar, and that's where their name comes from, the Telmarines. But then there's a drought, so they have to go up to Narnia and conquer it. And none of them realize that they originally came from Earth. Aslan's like, all right, Telmarines, even though you've been here for generations upon generations, it's time for many of you to go back. This is another one of those decisions of Aslan's that I don't know that I would totally get behind. We're going to reintroduce these people that have lived in Narnia for thousands of years, hundreds of years anyway, right? And we're going to reintroduce them to some island in the middle of the Pacific. They apparently originally came from hundreds of years ago Earth time. Instead of just sending them back to Telmar, why not send them back to Telmar?
Aslan gives them a choice, right? He gives them a chance of well, you can stay, but if you stay, you have to honor King Caspian. It's the younger Telmarines. They're like, yeah, we could live in this world. Yeah, we can make this work. Talking animals and King Caspian. Yeah, we can make this work. And it's the older one. I think there's a little note in the book where it's the older ones who had positions of power with King Miraz and were used to sort of getting their way. They were the ones that were resistant. They were the ones that were like, no, we can't live in this world of Narnia if there's such things as lions and talking bears and all this stuff. So it sort of makes it a choice on the part of the Telmarines. By the end, that those who are walking through the gate are essentially choosing to do so.
I like that a lot, the older versus younger breakdown, right? Because that totally tracks with everything we've sort of been talking about with this. And it also tracks with the fact that Peter and Susan have realized they're not going to be able to go back to Narnia, right? Aslan has told them that, and it's the younger two that get to go back. So this sort of thorough endorsement of childlikeness, both in kind of the metaphorical sense as well as in the literal sense, when younger people just have an easier time being childlike. As it turns out, that works really well. I still don't know why he wouldn't send the older ones back to Telmar instead of back to Earth, but that's okay. It's because the kids have to get back anyway to Earth. Anything else from this final chapter that you all wanted to make sure to talk about, or themes or anything like that?
One of the themes in Prince Caspian that I think are really interesting is this idea of if you want to believe something, you have to sort of walk in obedience first. Lucy and the children sort of have to follow the path before they see Aslan. That classic Christian idea of we're called to obedience and then it'll over time be revealed. Sometimes the Lord gives us the picture as we're following in obedience. And I think it's funny, he even gives the Telmarines that opportunity here. They don't want to walk through the door because they can't see it. And so Lewis has the children sort of walk through with them so that the Telmarines, believe that Aslan will send them back to the real world and not destroy them or kill them or whatever they're worried about. It's interesting. I don't know. It's something about that. You will see it as you do it. You'll see it as you follow Aslan, as you follow the path, following the path, even if you can't see where it's going.
Kind of in relationship to that, and this is something we've touched on, just the fact that Aslan works through surrogacy throughout the Chronicles, but specifically I think it's really strong in Prince Caspian because, everyone's claiming and complaining that he's not been on the scene. He's just disappeared for all of these years, and he's been there, and then he comes back and you're thinking, well, he can just storm that cave, do away with the enemies, get rid of Miraz with one chomp, but he doesn't choose to do it that way. He sort of stands in the background and allows these children, these animals, these people to take those steps, like you're talking about, those choices to trust and to obey, and he uses them to then liberate Narnia. And of course, then he does come in and he leads the romp. But I just find it really striking. That is the way Christ chooses to build his kingdom, as we've been saying all along, through children, through childlike faith, through the weak. I just think this is a fantastic picture of that, and an encouragement really to keep trusting and keep stepping forward and trust that romp is going to come.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Logan. Thank you, Mez. Thank you, Sophie. This has been wonderful. You all are welcome back anytime you want. Once a king or queen in the Inklings Variety Hour, always a king or queen in the Inklings Variety Hour. So we'd love to have you back anytime. With that, I say to you, listeners, walk through that door. This has been the Inklings Variety Hour. See you later.
All blessed encounter full of joy, unscheduled on the decent fan, with here an addict to Tolkien, there a Charles Williams fan.
I also just want to say, for those who have the illustrated versions of Prince Caspian, the illustration of the werewolf flying through the air at Caspian's head gave me nightmares as a child. I had a real thing about werewolves, and I think it came down to this illustration. It is terrifying. Go look at it if you've got it at home.
Is this the one? Is that the one?
Look at him doing the splits.
He's doing the splits. He's got like ballerina legs.
Exactly. Isn't that just perverse?
That's terrible. And you see the hag over here on the floor.
Yeah, I mean, I think the hag is scarier for my money.
Look at the hag's foot. What's going on?
Oh my goodness. They all have like Grinch feet.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, the hag and werewolf communities do not come off very well in this book.